Hello, everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
A cold welcome. Have you ever felt so unwelcome that you almost gave up on a dream you had carried for years? What if one short sentence from a stranger could make you question whether you truly belonged somewhere? In this story, I will share how a simple phrase, "go back home," almost changed the course of my life in America. But what happened next surprised me, taught me powerful lessons about language, culture, love, and human nature, and eventually transformed one of the most difficult relationships in my life into something I never expected. If you are learning English through stories, practicing slow English listening, improving your English speaking skills, or simply looking for an inspiring real-life style story, stay with me because this journey begins on a cold afternoon in the United States and ends in a way that even I could not have imagined. A strange thing happens when you move to a new place. You imagine the future in bright colors. You picture friendly smiles, exciting opportunities, and a fresh start. That was exactly how I felt when I arrived in a small American town several years ago. I was excited. I was nervous. Most of all, I was hopeful. I had spent months preparing for this new chapter. I practiced English every day. I watched videos. I listened to podcasts. I repeated simple phrases while cooking dinner. Sometimes I even talked to myself while driving. My pronunciation was not perfect, but I believed effort would eventually lead to confidence. The town looked beautiful when I first arrived. Wide streets stretched beneath tall trees. Small houses sat quietly behind neat lawns. American flags moved gently in the wind. It felt like the kind of place where people knew each other's names and waved from their front porches. At least that was what I expected. Reality introduced itself quickly. On my second day, I was carrying several boxes from my car to my new house. The weather was colder than I had anticipated. My hands felt numb. My back hurt. While struggling with a heavy box, I noticed an older man standing across the street. He was watching me. For a moment, I thought he might come over and say hello. Instead, he simply stared. I smiled awkwardly and raised my hand. He did not smile back. At first, I told myself not to worry. Maybe he was having a bad day. Maybe he was naturally quiet. People everywhere have different personalities. I continued unloading my belongings and tried to focus on settling into my new home. A few days later, I saw him again. This time, I was checking my mailbox. He walked past slowly. I smiled and said, "Good morning." He looked directly at me. His expression hardened. Then he said four words that hit me harder than I expected. "Go back home." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood him. English was not my first language. Perhaps I heard incorrectly. Perhaps he was speaking to someone else. But there was nobody else around. The message was clear. I stood there frozen. He continued walking without another word. The silence afterward felt heavier than the sentence itself. Many people think confidence disappears because of one major failure. Research in psychology often suggests something different. Confidence is frequently damaged by repeated small experiences that create doubt. A negative comment, an uncomfortable interaction, a feeling of exclusion. Each one seems tiny on its own, but together they slowly shape how we see ourselves. That day, I felt exactly that process beginning. Suddenly, every mistake I made in English felt larger. Every accent difference sounded louder. Every awkward conversation seemed like evidence that maybe I did not belong. If you are learning English right now, you may understand this feeling. Perhaps you hesitate before speaking. Perhaps you worrying that others will judge your pronunciation. Perhaps you stay silent because silence feels safer than making mistakes. Scientists studying language learning have found that emotional stress can directly affect language performance. When people feel anxious, the brain often struggles to retrieve vocabulary and process information efficiently. In simple words, fear makes speaking harder. I experienced that firsthand. The next time I visited a local grocery store, I stumbled over words I had used hundreds of times before. My mind felt crowded. I kept replaying those four words, go back home. Yet, something interesting happened. A young cashier smiled warmly and asked how my day was going. A woman behind me patiently waited while I searched for the correct words. An employee helped me find an item I could not locate. None of them treated me badly. None of them cared about my accent. None of them seemed bothered that I was still learning English. That confused me. If the town truly rejected me, why were so many people kind? For days, I thought about that question. One afternoon, while sitting alone in my kitchen, I realized something important. One person had spoken for himself, not for an entire community. That may sound obvious, but when people feel hurt, the brain often makes quick generalizations. One negative experience starts representing everyone. One rejection starts predicting the future. Psychologists call this a cognitive distortion. I called it a trap, and I had nearly fallen into it. So I made a decision. I would not leave. I would not stop practicing English. I would not hide inside my house. Instead, I would continue learning one conversation at a time. One greeting at a time. One mistake at a time. Every morning, I challenged myself to speak with someone new. Sometimes the conversations lasted only 30 seconds. Sometimes they felt awkward. Sometimes I forgot simple words. Yet every interaction taught me something valuable. Weeks passed. The town slowly became more familiar. The local coffee shop recognized my order. The librarian greeted me by name. The mail carrier waved when passing my house. Life was improving. Yet one mystery remained. The neighbor across the street. The man who had told me to go back home. I noticed him often. He rarely smiled. He rarely talked to anyone. Even other neighbors seemed distant around him. There was a sadness about him that I could not fully explain. At the time, I assumed he simply disliked me. What I did not know was that his story was far more complicated than I imagined. What I did not know was that this man would eventually become one of the most important people in my American journey. And what I definitely did not know was that the same person who once told me to leave would one day stand on my front porch and say words that would completely change everything. Words I never expected to hear. Words that would take years to arrive. Words that began with a simple greeting and ended with something much deeper. But before that transformation could happen, both of us would face challenges neither one of us saw coming. And the first real test was closer than either of us realized. Learning through silence. If someone asked me what taught me the most English during my first months in America, they might expect a surprising answer. Maybe a language course, maybe a textbook, maybe an online teacher. But the truth is much stranger. Silence became one of my greatest teachers, not because silence gave me answers, but because it forced me to listen more carefully than ever before. And as you will discover in this chapter of my story, sometimes the distance between strangers is not created by language alone. Sometimes it is built from assumptions, fear, pride, and experiences hidden beneath the surface. Looking back now, I realized that the weeks after hearing the words "go back home" were not simply about improving my English. They were about learning how people reveal themselves slowly, often without saying very much at all. Every morning, I followed the same routine. I woke up early, made coffee, and sat near the front window of my small house. From there, I could see part of the neighborhood waking up. Parents walked children to school buses. Dogs pulled their owners down sidewalks. Delivery trucks moved through quiet streets. At first, these scenes seemed ordinary. But for someone learning English and adapting to a new culture, every small interaction became a lesson. In many countries, people communicate differently. The rhythm of conversation changes. Personal space changes. Humor changes. Even greetings change. One thing that surprised me about my town was how often strangers smiled. Yet another thing surprised me even more. Many conversations remained brief. People were friendly, but they respected boundaries. They might ask, "How are you?" without expecting a 10-minute explanation. They might wave from a distance rather than stopping to talk. Understanding these social patterns felt almost like learning a second language inside the English language itself. Researchers who study intercultural communication often explain that successful communication depends on much more than vocabulary. Tone, body language, timing, and shared expectations all influence understanding. During those early weeks, I experienced this reality every day. One afternoon, I entered a local bakery. The employee behind the counter greeted me with a cheerful smile. She asked, "What can I get for you today?" I understood every word. Yet for some reason, my brain froze. The line behind me grew longer. I suddenly became aware of my accent. My heart beat faster. I forgot the name of the pastry I wanted. For several awkward seconds, I stood there staring at the display case. Finally, I pointed and said, "That one, please." The employee smiled kindly. Nothing terrible happened. Nobody laughed, nobody complained. Yet, I walked out realizing something important. My biggest obstacle was no longer grammar. It was fear. Psychologists call this the spotlight effect. People often believe others are paying far more attention to their mistakes than they actually are. In reality, most people are focused on their own lives, learning that lessons change everything. Instead of trying to speak perfectly, I started focusing on communicating clearly. The difference was small but powerful. My confidence began growing one conversation at a time. Meanwhile, the mysterious neighbor across the street remained distant. Sometimes I saw him working in his yard. Sometimes he sat alone on his porch. Occasionally, our eyes met. He never smiled. He never waved. The strange thing was that his behavior started making me curious instead of angry. Human beings naturally want explanations. When we encounter a puzzle, our brains search for missing pieces. The more I observed him, the more questions appeared. Why was he so cold? Had he always been that way? Did he dislike everyone or only me? Was there a reason behind his behavior that I could not see? One evening, I was taking out the trash when I noticed another neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, watering flowers near her driveway. She was one of the friendliest people on the street. We exchanged greetings often. That evening, she asked how I was adjusting to life in town. We talked for several minutes. Then she glanced across the street toward the older man. "Don't take Carl personally," she said quietly. The statement immediately caught my attention. It was the first time I had learned his name. Carl. Mrs. Wilson did not explain further. She simply changed the subject. Yet her words stayed with me. "Don't take Carl personally." The sentence felt like a clue in a mystery novel. What exactly did she mean? Had something happened in his past? Did everyone know a story that I didn't? The next few days only deepened my curiosity. One morning, I noticed Carl helping another elderly resident carry groceries. The action surprised me. It did not fit the image I had created in my mind. The man who told me to go back home was helping someone without hesitation. A week later, I saw him repairing a broken fence for another neighbor again. The behavior seemed inconsistent. If Carl was simply mean, why was he helping people? The contradiction bothered me. Social psychologists often describe something called attribution error. We tend to explain other people's behavior as a reflection of their character, while explaining our own behavior as a result of circumstances. In simple words, when someone acts badly, we assume they are a bad person. When we act badly, we blame stress, exhaustion, or difficult situations. Perhaps I had fallen into that trap. Perhaps Carl's behavior reflected something deeper than simple prejudice. Yet despite these thoughts, I still remembered his words. "Go back home." They had not disappeared. They remained lodged somewhere in my memory like a splinter beneath the skin. Then something unexpected happened that changed the direction of my story. One Saturday morning, Dark clouds rolled across the sky. Weather forecasts warned of a strong storm approaching the area. Most residents spent the day preparing. Lawn furniture disappeared from porches. Garbage bins were secured. Windows were checked. The entire neighborhood seemed unusually busy. I was still unfamiliar with severe American weather, so I did not think much about it. After all, storms happen everywhere. But as evening approached, the wind became stronger than anything I had experienced since arriving in the United States. Trees swayed violently. Rain hammered rooftops. The sky flashed repeatedly with bright bursts of lightning. Around midnight, the electricity suddenly failed. The neighborhood disappeared into darkness. Sitting alone in my house, listening to the storm outside, I felt a strange mixture of uncertainty and isolation. Then, through the front window, I noticed movement across the street. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness. Someone was outside. Someone was heading toward my property despite the storm. At first, I assumed I was imagining things. Then the figure moved closer. The rain made identification difficult. But as the flashlight beam approached my front yard, I realized exactly who it was: Carl. The last person I expected to see standing outside my house in the middle of a violent storm was the same man who had once told me to leave. And yet, there he was, moving quickly through the wind and rain, carrying something in his hands. What happened next would become the first crack in the wall that existed between us. A wall neither of us fully understood, and the beginning of a story that was about to become far more complicated than either one of us imagined. The neighbor next door. A storm has a strange way of revealing things that ordinary days keep hidden. Sometimes it reveals weak tree branches. Sometimes it reveals weaknesses in a house. And sometimes it reveals parts of people that remain invisible for years. As I watched the flashlight beam move through the darkness toward my yard that night, I felt confused, cautious, and honestly a little nervous. This was Carl, the same neighbor who had looked at me with cold eyes and told me to go back home. Yet now he was outside in heavy rain, walking directly toward my property while most people were staying indoors. The wind howled around the houses. Rain slammed against the windows. For a moment I wondered if something was wrong. Maybe a tree had fallen. Maybe there was some emergency I had not noticed. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the front door. The storm immediately pushed cold air into the house. Carl stood near the edge of my yard pointing toward a large tree beside my driveway. His voice was loud to compete with the wind. "Your branch is cracking," he shouted. I aimed my flashlight upward. He was right. A massive branch hung above part of my driveway, twisting violently during each gust of wind. One more strong push and it looked ready to fall. Carl stepped closer. "Move your car now," he yelled. There was no hostility in his voice, no sarcasm, no anger, just urgency. Within minutes, I moved the car farther down the street. Less than 5 minutes later, the branch finally snapped. The sound echoed through the neighborhood like an explosion. It crashed directly onto the exact spot where my vehicle had been parked. I stared at the fallen branch in disbelief. Had Carl not warned me, the damage would have been severe. We stood there silently for a few seconds while rain soaked our jackets. Then Carl nodded once and turned away. No dramatic conversation, no explanation, no apology for his earlier words. He simply walked back toward his house and disappeared into the darkness. I remained on my porch long after he left. My mind struggled to make sense of what had happened. Human beings love simple stories. Good people, bad people, friends, enemies, heroes, villains. Reality is rarely that convenient. Carl had just complicated the story I had been telling myself. The next morning, the storm had passed, sunlight returned. Residents emerged from their homes to inspect damage. Broken branches littered the streets. Several fences had collapsed. Debris covered many yards. As I cleaned my property, I noticed Carl across the street gathering fallen limbs. For a moment, I considered walking over to thank him. Then doubt appeared. Would he even want to talk? Would he ignore me? Would I make the situation awkward? Eventually, I decided that gratitude mattered more than discomfort. I crossed the street. "Thank you for last night," I said. Carl looked up from his work. His expression remained difficult to read. "Just didn't want your car crushed," he replied. "Still, thank you." He gave a small nod. The conversation ended there, not exactly the beginning of a friendship. Yet something had shifted. A tiny crack had appeared in the wall between us. Over the following weeks, our interactions remained brief but noticeable. We occasionally exchanged greetings. Sometimes he acknowledged me with a nod. Other times he seemed distracted and distant. The inconsistency fascinated me. One day he appeared almost approachable. The next day he seemed determined to avoid everyone. The mystery surrounding him only grew stronger. Meanwhile, my life in America continued evolving. My English improved steadily because I practiced every day. Instead of memorizing complicated vocabulary lists, I focused on simple conversations. Language researchers often emphasize that frequent exposure and meaningful communication create stronger learning than perfectionism. Looking back, I realized they were absolutely right. Every interaction became part of my education. At the grocery store, I learned common expressions. At the coffee shop, I learned informal speech. At community events, I learned how humor and storytelling worked in everyday American culture. Most importantly, I learned that mistakes rarely mattered as much as I feared. The more I spoke, the more confident I became. Yet despite these positive changes, Carl remained the most puzzling person in my neighborhood. Then came the barbecue. In many American communities, neighborhood gatherings play an important role in building social connections. One Saturday afternoon, several families organized a small barbecue in a local park. Children ran across the grass. Music played softly from portable speakers. The smell of grilled food filled the air. It felt like one of those classic small-town American scenes people imagine when thinking about community life. I almost did not attend. Part of me worried I would feel out of place. Fortunately, I went anyway. That decision would prove important. As the event continued, I noticed Carl sitting alone at a picnic table near the edge of the park. While most people socialized in groups, he seemed content observing from a distance. Once again, curiosity pulled at me. Why did he isolate himself? Why did someone who occasionally helped neighbors avoid becoming close to them? Throughout the afternoon, I watched subtle interactions. People greeted Carl politely. He responded politely. Yet conversations rarely lasted long. It was as though an invisible barrier surrounded him. Then something unexpected happened. A young boy accidentally dropped a plate of food while running. The child looked devastated. Before the parents could react, Carl calmly stood up, grabbed another plate, and handed it to the boy. The child's face brightened immediately. Carl even managed a brief smile. It lasted only a second, but I saw it. That tiny moment completely challenged the image I had carried for months. A truly cruel person would not have responded that way. The puzzle pieces still did not fit together. Later that evening, as people prepared to leave, I overheard two longtime residents discussing Carl. Their conversation was quiet, but I caught enough words to spark even greater curiosity. One of them mentioned that Carl had changed years ago. The other replied with a sentence that stayed with me for days. After what happened to his family, nobody was surprised. His family. The phrase echoed in my thoughts. Suddenly, a possibility emerged that I had never seriously considered. What if Carl's behavior was connected to some painful event from his past? What if the bitterness I saw was not the cause of his loneliness, but the result of it? Psychology offers an interesting insight here. Emotional pain often disguises itself. Some people express sadness through tears. Others express it through withdrawal, irritation, or emotional distance. To outsiders, These behaviors can appear hostile even when the deeper emotion is grief. I did not know whether that explanation applied to Carl, but for the first time, I began wondering if there was a story behind the man instead of merely a problem. A few days later, I would stumble upon a clue that changed everything. It happened on an ordinary evening while checking my mailbox. I noticed a faded photograph partially sticking out from a pile of papers that had blown into the street. The photograph had apparently fallen from somewhere nearby. As I picked it up, I immediately recognized one of the people in the picture. It was Carl, but the man smiling in that photograph looked nothing like the Carl I knew. And standing beside him was a woman and a young girl I had never seen before. In that moment, I realized the real story of my neighbor had not even begun to reveal itself. Small words, small steps. A photograph can sometimes do what years of observation cannot. It can expose a hidden chapter of someone's life in a single glance. That evening, as I stood beside my mailbox holding the faded picture, I felt as if I had accidentally opened a door that was never meant to be unlocked. The man smiling in the photograph looked younger, healthier, and somehow lighter. His shoulders were relaxed. His eyes carried warmth. Beside him stood a woman with bright eyes, and a young girl who could not have been older than 10. All three were laughing at something beyond the edge of the frame. It was difficult to believe this cheerful man and the quiet neighbor across the street were the same person. The contrast was so dramatic that I looked at the photograph several times to make sure I was not mistaken. The question immediately appeared in my mind. What happened? Human beings are natural storytellers. When we discover a missing piece of information, our brains rush to build explanations. Maybe Carl had divorced. Maybe he had lost contact with his family. Maybe they'd moved away. Countless possibilities floated through my imagination. Yet one thing became clear. The cold, distant man I knew was not the whole story. At some point in his life, Carl had been deeply happy. The challenge was understanding how that happiness disappeared. For several minutes I debated what to do with the photograph. Eventually, I crossed the street and walked toward Carl's house. His truck sat in the driveway. Lights glowed behind the front windows. My heart beat slightly faster than it should have. Returning a photograph should have been simple. Yet, something about the situation felt strangely important. I knocked on the door. A few seconds later, Carl opened it. His expression immediately shifted when he saw the photograph in my hand. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. His eyes widened slightly, then they softened. "I found this near the mailbox," I said. He stared at the picture for a moment before carefully taking it from my hand. "Thank you," he replied quietly. For several seconds neither of us spoke. The silence felt different from previous silences. Less defensive, less uncomfortable, more thoughtful. Then Carl surprised me. That was a long time ago. He glanced down at the photograph again. "Looks like another lifetime." There was something in his voice that caught my attention. Not anger, not bitterness. Sadness. Deep sadness. Before I could respond, he nodded politely and stepped back inside. The conversation ended. The door closed. Yet those few words stayed with me. Looks like another lifetime. Over the next few days, I noticed myself thinking about Carl more often than before. Not because I wanted answers out of curiosity alone. Something else had changed. Empathy had entered the picture. Once we see evidence that someone has suffered, it becomes harder to view them as a simple villain. Psychologists often describe empathy as the ability to imagine another person's emotional reality. Interestingly, studies suggest that empathy grows when we learn personal details about someone's experiences. A name becomes a story. A stranger becomes a human being. That process was happening inside me. Meanwhile, life continued moving forward. My English improved steadily, although not through any dramatic breakthrough. Improvement came through tiny daily actions. Looking back, one of the most valuable lessons I learned in America involved language learning itself. Many people believe success arrives through giant efforts, The reality is often the opposite. Small actions repeated consistently create remarkable change over time. Every morning, I practiced 10 new phrases. Every afternoon, I tried using at least one of them in conversation. Every evening, I spent a few minutes listening to spoken English. None of these activities felt impressive. Yet, together they transformed my confidence. Neuroscience supports this idea. The brain strengthens connections through repetition. Small learning sessions performed regularly often produce better long-term results than occasional intense study sessions. In simple terms, consistency beats intensity. This principle would soon apply not only to language learning but also to my relationship with Carl. One morning, I noticed him struggling with several heavy bags of garden soil. Normally, I would have continued walking. After all, our relationship remained distant. Yet something pushed me to stop. "Need a hand?" I asked. Carl looked surprised. For a moment, I thought he would refuse. Instead, he shrugged. "Sure." We carried the bags together. The entire task lasted less than 10 minutes. Most of the time, we worked in silence. Yet when the final bag was unloaded, Carl thanked me. The interaction seemed insignificant. In reality, it marked an important shift. Trust rarely appears suddenly. More often, it grows through repeated small experiences: a greeting, a favor, a shared moment. Tiny bricks slowly forming a bridge. Weeks pass. Our conversations remained brief but increasingly frequent. We discussed weather, yard work, local events. Nothing personal, nothing emotional. Yet, the tension that once defined our interactions gradually weakened. Then one evening, another clue appeared. I was returning home after visiting the grocery store when I noticed Carl sitting alone on his porch. A cardboard box rested beside him. He appeared distracted, lost in thought. As I approached my house, a gust of wind lifted several papers from the box. The papers scattered across the lawn. Without thinking, I hurried over to help collect them. Carl stood quickly, looking embarrassed. Together we gathered the papers before the wind carried them farther away. Most appeared to be ordinary documents. Then one item caught my attention: a child's drawing, crayon colors. A smiling family, a house, a bright yellow sun. The drawing looked old, very old. Carl gently took it from my hand. His eyes lingered on the picture. "My daughter made this," he said softly. The words hit me harder than expected. Daughter, not daughter makes, not daughter made recently. The sentence carried a strange weight. Before I could ask anything, Carl carefully placed the drawing back into the box. His expression closed again. The emotional door that had briefly opened swung shut. Yet now I knew something important. The young girl in the photograph was his daughter, and whatever had happened to his family still affected him deeply. That night, I found myself unable to stop thinking about the drawing. The smile on the child's face, the sadness in Carl's eyes, the contrast between past happiness and present loneliness. Stories often become interesting when questions appear. At that moment, I had more questions than answers. Why did Carl keep those old drawings? Why did he look at them as if they were priceless treasures? What happened to the woman and the girl in the photograph? And perhaps most importantly, why did a man carrying so much visible pain once look at me and say, "Go back home"? Was his anger truly directed at me? Or was I simply standing in the path of something much older and much deeper? I did not know it yet, but the answer was closer than ever. And when it finally arrived, it would completely transform the way I understood Carl, the neighborhood, and even my own journey in America. Winter changes everything. Winter arrived quietly at first, almost politely, as if it were asking permission to enter the neighborhood. The leaves disappeared, the air sharpened. Morning frost covered lawns like a thin layer of glass. For someone who had not spent much time in colder parts of the United States before, every day felt like a new lesson. I learned how quickly weather forecasts became serious topics of conversation. I learned why people checked road conditions before leaving home. I learned that Americans could discuss snow with the same intensity that sports fans discuss championship gains. But most importantly, I learned that winter has a remarkable ability to expose both strengths and weaknesses not only in houses and roads, but also in relationships. Looking back, the season that nearly isolated our neighborhood would eventually become the season that changed everything between Carl and me. One evening, local news channels began issuing warnings about an approaching winter storm. Residents stocked up on groceries. Gas stations became unusually busy. Store shelves emptied faster than normal. Experienced neighbors treated the forecast with respect. As someone still adjusting to life in this part of America, I paid attention to their behavior. When an entire community prepares for something, it is usually wise to prepare as well. The forecast predicted heavy snowfall, freezing temperatures, and dangerous conditions lasting several days. Nobody knew exactly how severe the storm would become. Yet the uncertainty itself created tension. Psychologists often explain that uncertainty can be more stressful than bad news because the human brain prefers predictable problems over unknown outcomes. I could feel that principle working throughout the neighborhood. People smiled and chatted as usual, but there was an undercurrent of concern beneath many conversations. The storm arrived during the night. By morning, the world outside my window had transformed. Snow covered everything. Cars looked like white sculptures. Streets disappeared beneath thick layers of ice and snow. Trees bent under the weight of frozen accumulation. The neighborhood felt strangely quiet, beautiful, but also isolated. At first, the situation seemed manageable. Then the temperature dropped even further. The following night brought powerful winds that pushed snow across roads and sidewalks. Visibility decreased. Travel became difficult. Utility crews struggled to keep up with growing problems throughout the region. Then came the moment that changed the story. Around midnight, my heating system stopped working. At first, I assumed the issue was temporary. Maybe the power grid was overloaded. Maybe service would return within minutes. Instead, the house grew colder. After hour passed. The indoor temperature continued falling. By early morning, the situation was becoming serious. I contacted the utility company and learned that widespread outages had affected parts of the area. Repair crews were working, but restoration times remained uncertain. Suddenly, a simple inconvenience became a real challenge. The irony was impossible to ignore. Months earlier, I had worried about fitting into a new community. Now I was sitting alone in a freezing house wondering how long I could safely remain there. Human beings often imagine independence as strength, yet situations like this reveal a different truth. Communities exist because no one can handle everything alone. As temperatures continued dropping, I layered blankets, wore multiple jackets, and tried to remain positive. Several hours later, someone knocked on my door. When I opened it, cold air rushed inside. Standing there was Carl. Snow covered his boots. His heavy coat was dusted with ice crystals. "Your chimney isn't working," he said immediately. "No heat." I nodded. He looked past me into the house. "How cold is it inside?" I told him. His expression tightened. "That's not good." There was no hesitation in his face, no awkwardness, no reminder of our difficult beginning. He simply assessed the situation like someone responding to a practical problem. "Come over to my place for a while," he said. For a second, I wondered if I had heard correctly. This was the same man who once told me to go back home. Now he was inviting me into his house during a winter emergency. Life can be strange that way. Sometimes the people we least expect become important precisely when we need help most. A few minutes later, I carried a small bag across the street. Stepping inside Carl's home felt surprisingly significant. Until then, our interactions had occurred outdoors, in driveways, on sidewalks, or during brief neighborhood encounters. Crossing his front door felt like crossing another invisible boundary. The interior was warm and simple. Family photographs decorated several walls. A fireplace glowed softly in the living room. The atmosphere felt comfortable, yet there was also quiet loneliness hanging in the space. It was the kind of home that clearly once held more people than it did now. Carl offered coffee. We sat near the fireplace. For a while, we talked about the storm, road conditions, weather forecasts, utility repairs, safe topics, familiar topics. Then something unexpected happened. My eyes drifted toward a framed photograph on a nearby shelf. It was the same woman and young girl I had seen in the faded picture weeks earlier. Carl noticed my attention. For a brief moment, silence settled between us. I considered looking away. Instead, I quietly asked, "Your family?" Carl stared into the fireplace. The flames reflected in his eyes. Several seconds passed before he answered, "My wife and daughter." His voice was calm, but there was something beneath it. Something fragile. Then he added 4 words that immediately changed everything. "They passed away years ago." The room seemed to become quieter. Even the crackling fire sounded distant. Suddenly, countless puzzle pieces began connecting inside my mind. The sadness, the isolation, the old photographs, the child's drawing, the emotional distance. None of it had been random. Grief had been standing behind every interaction from the beginning. Researchers who study bereavement often note that profound loss can permanently alter a person's relationship with the world. Some individuals become more open. Others withdraw. Some continue functioning normally on the surface, while carrying invisible emotional weight every day. Looking at Carl, I realized I had spent months judging the visible behavior without understanding the hidden burden. Yet, one mystery still remained unresolved. If grief explained his sadness, it did not fully explain why he had looked at me and said, "Go back home." There was another piece of the story missing. Another chapter I had not yet seen. As snow continued falling outside, Carl stared quietly into the fire. His expression suggested he was standing on the edge of a difficult memory. I sensed that he wanted to say something more, and for the first time since moving to America, I felt that the truth behind our complicated relationship was finally about to emerge. What Carl revealed next would not only explain his past, it would force me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about resentment, loneliness, and the surprising ways people carry pain through the years. A story behind anger. The fire crackled softly between us, but the warmth in the room could not completely erase the heaviness that had suddenly appeared. Outside, snow continued falling across the neighborhood, covering streets, rooftops, and cars in a silent white blanket. Inside Carl's living room, another kind of storm was beginning to unfold. For months, I had been trying to understand the man across the street. I had seen his anger, his distance, his contradictions, and his loneliness. Now, sitting beside the fireplace while winter raged outside, I finally stood at the edge of the truth. Carl stared into the flames for so long that I wondered if he had forgotten I was there. Then he slowly leaned back in his chair and let out a deep breath. It was the kind of breath people take when carrying something heavy for far too long. "You ever notice," he said quietly, "how people think grief gets smaller with time?" I listened without interrupting. Most people imagine it fades away, like a wound healing, like a scar disappearing. He shook his head slightly. Sometimes it doesn't work that way. Sometimes life grows around the grief, but the grief stays the same size. His words struck me because they sounded less like a conversation and more like a confession. Psychology researchers often describe grief not as something people overcome, but as something they learn to carry. Many studies have shown that major losses can reshape identity itself. The person who experiences the loss may continue living, working, smiling, and functioning, but internally, they are navigating a completely different landscape. Looking at Carl, I could see that reality in front of me. He was not simply remembering a painful event. He was living with it every day. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he surprised me again. The accident happened 12 years ago. The sentence landed quietly, yet its impact felt enormous. I knew immediately what accident he meant. Carl continued speaking slowly, almost as if he were reading memories directly from the fire. My wife and daughter were driving home after visiting relatives. Snowstorm, bad visibility, wrong place, wrong time. His voice remained steady, but his eyes never left the flames. A truck lost control. The room fell silent again. I felt the knot forming in my chest. No clever response existed. No comforting sentence could undo a tragedy like that. Carl wasn't looking for sympathy anyway. He wasn't telling a story to receive comfort. He seemed to be telling it because after years of silence, the words finally needed somewhere to go. After that, he continued, everything changed. Those 3 words carried more weight than an entire paragraph. Everything changed. Anyone who has experienced major loss understands that reality. The same world remains physically present, yet nothing feels the same. Familiar places become painful reminders. Happy memories become complicated. Even ordinary moments can trigger unexpected waves of emotion. Carl stood up and walked toward a bookshelf. From one of the shelves, he removed an old photo album. Returning to his chair, he carefully opened it. Inside were photographs from another life, family vacations, birthday parties, school events, summer picnics, smiling faces frozen in time. As he turned the pages, I realized something important. The photographs were not simply records of the past. They were evidence, proof that happiness had once existed. Proof that the people he loved had been real. Many grief experts explain that remembering becomes an essential part of healing because memory preserves connection. Looking at those photographs, I understood exactly what they meant to him. Then Carl turned to a picture of his daughter holding a homemade sign. The words on it were written in colorful letters. Welcome home. He stared at the image for several seconds before speaking again. She made signs like that all the time. A faint smile appeared, then disappeared. The contrast was heartbreaking, joy and pain occupying the same memory. Happiness and loss existing together. Yet despite everything he had shared, one question still remained in my mind. It was the question that had followed me since my second day in town. Why had he told me to go back home? Before I could decide whether to ask, Carl answered it himself. You probably wonder about what I said when you first moved here. I looked at him. He nodded slowly. I remember it. The room felt smaller. The moment I had unknowingly been moving toward for months had finally arrived. Carl looked down at his hands. You weren't the first person who moved into that house. I frowned slightly. That was information I had never heard before. A family lived there years ago, he said. Good people. He paused. After my wife and daughter died, they were some of the few people who kept checking on me. His voice softened. Eventually they moved away. Another pause followed. Then more people came and left. House changed owners several times. Suddenly, I began sensing where the story was heading. Carl continued. Every time someone left, it felt like losing another piece of the life I remembered. He laughed quietly, though there was no humor in it. Sounds irrational now, but psychology tells us that emotional reactions often follow patterns that logic cannot easily control. Humans naturally attach memories to places. A street corner, a park bench, a neighborhood. When those places change, old emotions can resurface unexpectedly. Carl wasn't angry because I had done something wrong. He was reacting to what my arrival represented: change. Another reminder that time had continued moving forward without the people he loved. When I saw you unloading boxes, he admitted, what I could think was that everything keeps changing. He shook his head, and I was tired of losing things. For the first time, I truly understood. His words months earlier had never really been about me. They were aimed at his own pain. I had simply been standing nearby when it surfaced. That realization did not excuse what he said, but it transformed the meaning behind it. Anger often appears powerful on the outside, yet psychologists frequently point out that anger is sometimes a secondary emotion protecting something more vulnerable underneath: fear, sadness, loneliness, grief. Carl's anger had been wearing grief's clothes all along. The strange thing was that once I understood that truth, resentment became much harder to maintain. Empathy has a way of dissolving certain kinds of anger, not because harmful behavior becomes acceptable, but because understanding changes the emotional landscape. Outside, the storm slowly weakened. Snow still fell, but less aggressively. The neighborhood remained buried beneath winter. Yet, the sense of danger was fading. Inside the house, another change was occurring. The wall that had separated Carl and me for months was finally breaking apart, not through dramatic speeches, not through heroic actions, through honesty, through listening, through the simple act of allowing another human being to tell their story. As the evening continued, Carl closed the photo album and placed it beside the fireplace. For the first time since I had known him, his expression seemed lighter, not happy, not healed, but lighter. Yet, neither of us realized that this conversation was only the beginning, because over the coming months, something unexpected would happen. The neighbor who once wanted everyone to stay away would slowly become part of my daily life, and as our friendship grew, another chapter was waiting just around the corner, a chapter involving coffee, family memories, unexpected laughter, and a conversation that would change both of us in ways neither one of us could possibly predict. Coffee and conversations. Some friendships begin with laughter. Some begin with shared interests. Ours began with a storm, a misunderstanding, and a truth that had been hidden beneath years of grief. If someone had told me during my first week in that American neighborhood that Carl and I would eventually spend afternoons drinking coffee together, I probably would have laughed. At that time, he was simply the man who stared from across the street and told me to go back home. Yet life rarely follows the stories we expect. Sometimes the people who challenge us the most end up teaching us the deepest lessons. And during the months that followed our conversation by the fireplace, Carl and I slowly discovered something surprising. Healing often begins when people stop pretending they are fine. Winter gradually loosened its grip on the town. Snowbanks shrank, sidewalks reappeared, the trees remained bare, but small signs of spring started appearing everywhere. The neighborhood felt more alive each week. Residents spent more time outdoors. Children returned to parks. Porch lights stayed on later into the evening. As the weather improved, so did my confidence. My English-speaking skills had become noticeably stronger. The daily conversations that once made me nervous now felt natural. Research on language acquisition consistently shows that confidence grows and learners use language in meaningful situations rather than focusing only on grammar exercises. Looking back, I realized that real conversations had become my classroom, and strangely enough, one of my most valuable conversation partners was now Carl. It started with coffee. One Saturday morning, I was carrying groceries from my car when I noticed Carl sitting on his porch. He raised a hand in greeting, a simple gesture. Yet months earlier it would have been unimaginable. Coffee, he asked, just one word, one invitation, one moment that quietly changed the direction of our friendship. I accepted. His kitchen smelled like freshly brewed coffee and old memories. The photographs remained on the shelves. The house still carried traces of the family that had once filled it with life. Yet something felt different now. The sadness was still there, but it no longer dominated every corner. We sat at the table and talked. At first, the conversation stayed simple. Local news, weather, home repairs, sports, typical small-town topics. But over time, the discussions became deeper. Human connection often develops this way. Trust is rarely built through dramatic revelations. It grows through repeated moments of safety. One conversation leads to another. One story invites another story. Eventually, people begin sharing parts of themselves they normally keep hidden. Carl started telling me about his wife, her sense of humor, her favorite recipes, her habit of singing while cleaning the house. He spoke about his daughter's love of drawing and her dream of becoming a teacher someday. The stories were often bittersweet, yet they carried warmth rather than despair. It was as though speaking about them allowed him to keep them present in his life. Psychologists sometimes describe storytelling as a powerful emotional tool because it helps people organize their experiences into meaningful narratives. In simple terms, telling our stories helps us understand our lives. Carl seemed to be rediscovering that process after years of silence. Eventually, he became curious about my story as well. One afternoon, he asked what life had been like before I moved to America. The question opened a completely different chapter of conversation. I told him about my early struggles learning English. I described the fear of speaking incorrectly, the embarrassment of misunderstanding simple questions, the loneliness that sometimes accompanies major life changes. Carl listened carefully, then he surprised me again. "You know," he said, "I used to think people who moved here had it easy." I laughed softly. "Easy?" He nodded. "New opportunities, fresh start, new life." Then he shook his head. "Didn't realize how much courage it takes." That statement stayed with me because it reflected something larger than our friendship. Understanding often begins when assumptions end. Before knowing me, Carl had created a story about who I was. Before knowing him, I had created a story about who he was. Both stories had been incomplete. Research in social psychology repeatedly demonstrates that direct personal contact reduces prejudice and increases empathy. The principle sounds simple because it is simple. People become harder to stereotype once we know them personally. Yet despite the growing friendship, there were still moments when grief unexpectedly surfaced. One afternoon, while drinking coffee, Carl suddenly stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. His eyes drifted toward the window. For several seconds he remained silent. I followed his gaze. Across the street, a father was teaching his daughter how to ride a bicycle. The scene looked ordinary, yet I immediately understood what had happened. Certain memories never fully disappear. They wait quietly until a sound, image, or situation brings them back. Carl eventually smiled sadly. My daughter loved bicycles. There was no dramatic breakdown, no emotional collapse. Just a simple sentence carrying years of history. Moments like that taught me something important about emotional resilience. Strength does not mean forgetting pain. Sometimes strength means learning how to live alongside it. As spring continued unfolding, our coffee conversations became routine. Neighbors started noticing. Some even joked about our unlikely friendship. The comments always made us laugh because they contained a strange truth. From the outside, our relationship probably looked improbable. Yet from the inside, it felt surprisingly natural. Shared humanity has a way of ignoring expectations. Then one afternoon, Carl asked a question that completely caught me off guard. "You ever been in love?" I nearly spilled my coffee. The sudden change of topic felt almost comical. Yet, there was genuine curiosity in his expression. I smiled. Not the easiest question to answer. Carl chuckled. Probably means yes. The conversation that followed would unexpectedly become one of the most important discussions of my life. We talked about relationships, commitment, marriage, sacrifice, the differences between romance in movies and romance in reality. Carl spoke openly about his marriage, describing both the beautiful moments and the ordinary challenges. One statement particularly stayed with me. "Love isn't built during the easy days," he said. "It's built during the difficult ones." The sentence sounded simple, yet it contained the kind of wisdom that only experience creates. At the time, I did not fully realize how significant those words would become, because while Carl was sharing lessons from his past, my own future was quietly approaching. Unknown to both of us, I was about to meet someone who would completely change my life. Someone who would eventually become my wife. Someone who would bring new joy, new challenges, a new meaning to my journey in America. And when that chapter began, Carl would play a role neither of us could have predicted, not as the angry neighbor from across the street, but as one of the people who helped me understand what love truly requires to survive and grow. Unexpected friendship. Friendships rarely announce themselves when they arrive. There is usually no dramatic soundtrack, no flashing sign, no unforgettable moment that clearly says, "This person is about to become important in your life." Instead, friendship often grows quietly in the background while people are busy focusing on other things. Looking back now, I cannot identify the exact day Carl stopped being the difficult neighbor across the street and became a genuine friend. The change happened so gradually that neither of us noticed it at first. Yet, by the time summer arrived, something remarkable had happened. The distance that once separated us had almost completely disappeared. The strange part was that our friendship continued growing through ordinary moments rather than extraordinary ones. We fixed broken fences. We helped neighbors move furniture. We shared meals during community gatherings. We talked about sports neither of us played and weather forecasts neither of us could control. The activities themselves were simple. The trust they created was powerful. Social scientists often emphasize that strong relationships develop through repeated positive interactions rather than grand gestures. Every small experience becomes a deposit in what some researchers call an emotional bank account. Over time, those deposits accumulate. Looking back, that is exactly what happened between Carl and me. One Saturday morning, I was mowing my lawn when Carl walked over carrying a toolbox. Without saying much, he pointed toward my porch steps. "That board's getting loose." He was right. One of the wooden boards had started separating from the frame. Before I could even respond, Carl was already kneeling down to inspect it. "We'll fix it before someone gets hurt." The word caught my attention. Months earlier, there had only been him and me. Separate, distant, suspicious. Now there was a we. It seemed like a small detail, but language often reveals emotional realities before people consciously recognize them. For the next hour, we worked together. While repairing the steps, our conversation drifted from home maintenance to community life. Carl knew nearly everyone in town, not because he was outgoing, but because he had lived there for decades. As he shared stories about neighbors, local traditions, and historical events, I realized I was receiving an informal education about American small-town culture. Many people imagine culture as something visible: food, clothing, holidays, or music. Yet much of culture exists in invisible habits: how neighbors help one another, how communities respond to emergencies, how trust develops over time. Carl became one of my greatest teachers in understanding those unwritten rules. The funny thing was that he never viewed himself as a teacher. He was simply sharing what he knew. One evening, our friendship faced an unexpected test. A severe thunderstorm moved through the area, bringing strong winds and heavy rain. Although it was not nearly as dangerous as the winter storm months earlier, several trees were damaged throughout the neighborhood. The next morning, residents emerged from their homes to assess the situation. One elderly couple a few houses away discovered that a large branch had crashed onto part of their garage roof. The damage was significant. Before anyone organized a response, Carl was already walking toward their house carrying tools. I followed him. Soon, several other neighbors joined us. What happened next felt like a perfect example of community in action. Nobody waited for formal instructions. Nobody asked who would be paid. People simply showed up. Some removed debris. Others secured damaged sections of the roof. Someone brought water. Someone else delivered food. Within a few hours, the elderly couple had more help than they could have imagined. Watching the scene unfold taught me an important lesson. Communities become strong when ordinary people repeatedly choose cooperation over convenience. Research on social resilience supports this idea. Neighborhoods with stronger interpersonal connections often recover more effectively from challenges because trust already exists before problems appear. During that morning, I noticed something else. Carl seemed completely different while helping others. The guarded, isolated version of him almost disappeared. In its place stood a man who was capable, generous, and deeply respected. Several neighbors saw his advice. Others thanked him for his assistance. For the first time, I began understanding how much he contributed to the community despite keeping emotional distance for so many years. Later that afternoon, while we loaded broken branches into a truck, I mentioned my observation. Carl laughed quietly. Helping is easier than talking. The statement sounded simple, but it revealed something profound. Many people express care through actions rather than words. Emotional communication takes different forms. Some people offer encouragement, others offer practical assistance. Carl belonged firmly to the second group, yet even he was changing. The man who once avoided personal conversations now occasionally initiated them. The man who once kept everyone at arm's length now seemed more willing to let people closer. Healing, I realized, is rarely dramatic. Most of the time it happens slowly enough that people only recognize it after looking back. A few weeks later, another important moment arrived. The town organized its annual summer festival, one of the largest community events of the year. Food vendors lined the streets. Local musicians performed throughout the day. Families filled the park. Children ran between activity booths carrying balloons and snacks. The atmosphere felt energetic and welcoming. Carl almost skipped the event. That did not surprise me. Large gatherings had never been his favorite environment. Somehow, I convinced him to attend. At first, he seemed uncomfortable. Crowds made him uneasy. Yet as the afternoon progressed, something unexpected happened. More and more people stopped to greet him. Old friends, former co-workers, neighbors he had known for years. Watching those interactions revealed a side of Carl that few people regularly saw. He laughed, he told stories. He even shared a few jokes. The transformation fascinated me. It reminded me how incomplete our understanding of others often is. We see a small portion of their lives and assume we know the whole story. In reality, every person contains countless versions of themselves depending on context, history, and circumstance. Then came the moment neither of us expected. While walking through the festival, we passed a community photo display featuring historical pictures from the town's past. Carl suddenly stopped. His attention locked onto one particular image. I followed his gaze. The photograph showed a community picnic from nearly 20 years earlier. Families smiled beneath bright summer sunlight. Children played in the background. And there, near the center of the image, stood Carl with his wife and daughter. For several seconds he simply stared. The crowd around us seemed to disappear. Then something remarkable happened. Instead of sadness, a genuine smile appeared on his face. Not a forced smile. Not a nostalgic smile hiding pain. A real one. They loved this festival, he said quietly. In that moment, I realized something had changed inside him. The memories no longer seemed defined solely by loss. They were beginning to reconnect with gratitude. Yet, the day was not finished surprising us, because while standing near that photo display, someone would walk into my life completely unexpectedly. A conversation lasting less than 2 minutes would begin a new chapter. A chapter involving love, family, and the future I could not yet imagine. And strangely enough, Carl would be one of the first people to notice what was happening long before I did. Love across differences. It is funny how life can spend months moving at a steady, predictable pace and then suddenly change direction because of one ordinary conversation. Not a dramatic movie scene, not a life-changing speech. Just a simple interaction that almost seems unimportant at the time. Looking back, that is exactly how the next chapter of my story began. During the town festival, While Carl and I stood near the historical photo display, I noticed a woman studying one of the photographs beside us. She seemed completely focused on the images, occasionally smiling at old pictures of the town. There was nothing extraordinary about the moment. Hundreds of people attended the festival, yet for reasons I still cannot fully explain, our paths crossed at exactly the right time. The conversation started with something simple. She asked whether I knew the year one of the photographs had been taken. I did not know the answer. Carl did. Within seconds, he joined the discussion. What followed was a brief exchange about local history, community traditions, and how much the town had changed over the years. Eventually, we introduced ourselves. Her name was Emily. At the time, I assumed that was the end of it. A pleasant conversation, nothing more. Life, however, had different plans. As Carl and I continued walking through the festival, he glanced at me with an expression I immediately recognized. It was the look people use when they know something you have not yet realized. What? I asked. Carl smiled. Nothing. That answer guaranteed I would not let the topic go. What? I repeated. His smile widened. You talked to her longer than you talked to anybody when you first moved here. I laughed. It was a normal conversation. Carl nodded slowly. Sure. The teasing continued for the rest of the afternoon. At the time, I considered it ridiculous. Yet, over the following weeks, I kept unexpectedly encountering Emily throughout town. Sometimes at the coffee shop, sometimes at community events, sometimes while shopping. Small towns have a way of creating those coincidences. Or at least they feel like coincidences. Each encounter led to another conversation. Each conversation lasted slightly longer than the previous one. One of the most interesting aspects of our connection involved cultural differences. Emily had spent her entire life in the United States. I had arrived from a completely different background. Our experiences, traditions, and perspectives often differed in fascinating ways. Yet instead of creating distance, those differences created curiosity. Research on healthy relationships frequently highlights the importance of mutual interest and active listening. People often feel connected when they believe someone genuinely wants to understand their world. That became one of the foundations of our relationship. We asked questions, we shared stories, we compared traditions. Sometimes we laughed at misunderstandings. Sometimes we learned something new. One evening, while walking through a local park, Emily asked about my experience learning English. The question opened a conversation I had never fully shared with anyone outside a language learning context. I described the anxiety, the mistakes, the fear of sounding foolish, the moments when simple conversations felt exhausting. Emily listened carefully before saying something that surprised me. You know what's funny, she said. I think you're brave. I almost laughed. Brave was not a word I associated with myself. Determined, maybe. Persistent, perhaps. But brave. Emily explained her reasoning. Most people avoid situations where they might fail or look awkward. You moved to a new country and kept trying anyway. Her perspective forced me to reconsider my own journey. Psychologists often discuss a phenomenon called self-distance. People frequently view their own struggles differently than outsiders do. We focus on mistakes while others notice perseverance. We remember fear while others remember courage. Hearing her perspective changed how I viewed certain chapters of my life. Over time, our friendship deepened, then friendship slowly evolved into something more. Not suddenly, not dramatically, gradually. The strongest relationships often develop this way. Trust first, connection second, romance later. One afternoon, I shared the news with Carl. His reaction was immediate. Took you long enough. I stared at him. You knew? Carl laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. Everybody knew. Apparently, I had been the last person to recognize what was happening. That realization became a source of endless amusement for Carl. For months afterward, he reminded me whenever possible. Yet beneath the humor, There was something meaningful happening. Carl genuinely seemed happy, not simply for me, but because he was witnessing life continue moving forward again. Researchers studying emotional recovery often note that helping others can create renewed purpose. Watching Carl support my growing relationship, I sensed that he was rediscovering parts of himself that grief had hidden for years. Still, relationships are never built entirely from easy moments. Every meaningful connection eventually encounters challenges. Ours arrived through cultural expectations and communication differences. Some misunderstandings were amusing, others felt frustrating. We occasionally interpreted situations differently because our life experiences had shaped us differently. Yet, those challenges taught us valuable lessons. Healthy relationships are not built on perfect agreement. They are built on respectful understanding. We learned how to listen before reacting, how to ask questions before making assumptions, how to remain curious even during disagreements. Those skills strengthened our connection far more than constant harmony ever could. One evening, after a particularly thoughtful conversation, Carl shared a piece of advice I never forgot. We were sitting on his porch watching the sunset paint the neighborhood in shades of gold and orange. The air felt warm. The street remained quiet. After listening to me talk about relationships for nearly half an hour, Carl finally interrupted. "Want to know the secret?" he asked. I smiled. "To what?" "Marriage." That answer immediately captured my attention. Carl leaned back in his chair. "Most people spend years trying to find the perfect person." He paused. "The better goal is finding someone willing to keep growing with you." The statement sounded simple, yet like many important truths, its power emerged through reflection rather than complexity. Growth, adaptation, partnership. Those ideas would eventually become central to my future. At that moment, however, I was focused on something much more immediate. I was falling in love. And for the first time since arriving in America, I could genuinely imagine building a future here. A real future. Not merely surviving, not merely adapting. Belonging. The irony was impossible to ignore. The same town where I once felt unwanted had slowly become home. The same street where I once heard the words "go back home" had become the place where friendship, healing, and love were beginning to flourish. Yet, the story was far from over. Because love may start with two people, but building a life together involves much more. Soon there would be engagement plans, wedding preparations, family traditions, unexpected challenges, and eventually children. And through every step of that journey, Carl would remain nearby, not as the angry neighbor from my first days in town, but as someone who had become part of the family we were only beginning to create. Building a family. There is a moment in many love stories that people rarely talk about. It comes after the excitement of falling in love, after the long conversations, after the butterflies, after the romantic uncertainty. It is the moment when do people stop asking, "Do we love each other?" and begin asking, "Can we build a life together?" Those questions are very different. Love may begin with emotion, but building a family requires choices, patience, flexibility, and a willingness to grow through challenges that nobody can fully predict. Looking back now, I realized that the years following my relationship with Emily becoming serious were some of the most meaningful years of my life. They were also some of the most educational. Not because I learned new grammar rules or advanced English vocabulary. I learned something far more valuable. I learned how people create a sense of home. The engagement itself was surprisingly simple. No elaborate production, no dramatic public spectacle. Just an honest conversation about the future, shared dreams, and a commitment to move forward together. When Emily said yes, my first feeling was happiness. My second feeling was disbelief. Years earlier, I had arrived in America carrying uncertainty, self-doubt, and a strong accent. Now I was preparing to marry someone I loved in the very country that once felt unfamiliar and intimidating. Life can be wonderfully unpredictable. When I shared the news with Carl, his reaction was immediate. He smiled wider than I had seen in years. Then he shook my hand and said, "About time." Apparently, his sense of humor had survived every challenge life had thrown at him. Wedding preparations introduced a completely new set of experiences. If you have ever planned a wedding, you already know the truth. Weddings are less about one special day and more about hundreds of small decisions: venues, guests, food, schedules, traditions, expectations. Every conversation seemed to create 3 new conversations. Yet the process also revealed something fascinating about culture. Emily and I came from different backgrounds. Naturally, our families carried different traditions and perspectives. Instead of viewing those differences as obstacles, we treated them as opportunities to learn from one another. Cultural psychologists often emphasize that successful intercultural relationships benefit from curiosity and flexibility. In simple terms, people do better when they ask questions instead of making assumptions. That principle became one of our greatest strengths. We spent countless evenings discussing family customs, holiday traditions, childhood memories, and personal values. Some differences surprised us. Others made us laugh. Many simply expanded our understanding of each other's worlds. The wedding day eventually arrived. Like most important days, it seemed to pass both slowly and quickly at the same time. Friends gathered, family members traveled long distances, the weather cooperated. Most importantly, the people we cared about surrounded us. Among them stood Carl. Watching him at the ceremony felt strangely emotional. Years earlier, he had barely spoken to me. Now, he sat among the people celebrating one of the most important days of my life. Human relationships can change in remarkable ways when given enough time and understanding. After the wedding, everyday life began. And this is where many stories become truly interesting. Movies often end with marriage. Real life starts there. Researchers who study long-term relationships frequently note that lasting partnerships are built less on dramatic moments and more on daily habits. Shared responsibilities, honest communication, mutual support. Those ordinary behaviors gradually create extraordinary bonds. Emily and I learned this lesson one day at a time. We built routines. We balanced work schedules. We navigated disagreements, we celebrated successes, we faced disappointments. Through it all, our relationship became stronger because it was grounded in friendship as much as romance. Several years later, another major chapter began. We became parents. Nothing could have fully prepared me for that experience. Every parent I knew had offered advice. Books provided guidance. Experts shared recommendations. Yet, the reality still felt overwhelming and beautiful at the same time. Holding our first child for the first time changed something inside me. Suddenly, priorities shifted. The future became more important. Responsibility felt deeper. Even simple decisions carried greater meaning. Developmental psychologists often explain that parenthood can reshape identity, because people begin viewing the world through a broader lens. I experienced exactly that transformation. The things that once seemed urgent became less important. The things that truly mattered became clearer. Sleep, however, became much harder to find. Some parenting experiences are apparently universal. As our family grew, so did our connection to the neighborhood. Children have a remarkable ability to create community. Conversations with neighbors became more frequent. Local events felt more meaningful. Parks became familiar gathering places. School activities introduced new friendships. Slowly, the town stopped feeling like a place where I lived and started feeling like a place where I belonged. One afternoon, while watching my children play in the front yard, I found myself remembering the day I first arrived. The contrast was almost unbelievable. Back then, I had stood alone unloading boxes while wondering whether I would ever fit in. Now laughter echoed across the same yard. Family photographs filled the house. Future plans extended years ahead. The journey from outsider to community member had happened so gradually that I almost missed it. Carl remained part of our lives throughout those years. In many ways, he became a grandfather figure to the children. He taught them how to plant flowers, how to identify birds, how to fix simple things around the house. The children adored him, and perhaps even more surprisingly, he adored them. Watching those relationships develop became one of the most heartwarming parts of our story. The man who once isolated himself from nearly everyone now spent afternoons teaching neighborhood kids practical skills and sharing stories. Healing had not erased his grief, but it had expanded his life again. One evening, while sitting on my porch after the children had gone inside, Carl joined me. The neighborhood looked peaceful. Streetlights glowed softly. Crickets filled the summer air with sound. We sat quietly for a few minutes before Carl spoke. "You know," he said, "for a while, I thought life was finished." His voice remained calm, not over, just finish. I understood exactly what he meant. Some losses can convince people that their best chapters are behind them. Carl looked across the street toward his house and smiled. Turns out I was wrong. The statement stayed with me because it captured something larger than his personal story. Human beings are remarkably capable of rebuilding meaning after hardship. Sometimes slowly, sometimes imperfectly, that often more successfully than they imagine. Yet, neither of us realized that another meaningful moment was approaching. A new family would soon move into the neighborhood. A simple moving truck would arrive, boxes would be unloaded, children would run across unfamiliar lawns, and Carl, the same man who once greeted newcomers with resentment, would face an opportunity to reveal just how much he had changed. From conflict to respect. One of the most fascinating things about human nature is that people often do not notice how much they have changed until life gives them a chance to. Compare the present with the past. Growth usually happens quietly. Day by day, conversation by conversation, choice by choice. Then one ordinary moment arrives and suddenly the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. For Carl, that moment appeared on a bright Saturday morning when a moving truck rolled into our neighborhood. At first, nobody paid much attention. Moving trucks were not unusual. Families arrived. Families left. Life continued. Yet, as I watched workers unload furniture from the large vehicle parked 3 houses away, an unexpected memory surfaced. I remembered my own arrival years earlier. I remembered carrying boxes into an unfamiliar house. I remembered feeling nervous about fitting in. Most vividly, I remembered hearing for words that had stayed with me for a very long time. Go back home. Standing there in my driveway, I found myself wondering how Carl would react to the new neighbors. The thought crossed my mind only briefly. Then I noticed something surprising. Carl was already walking toward the moving truck. For a moment, I simply watched. There was something symbolic about the scene. Years earlier, another newcomer had arrived carrying uncertainty and hope. Now history seemed to be offering Carl an opportunity to respond differently. The new family appeared overwhelmed. 2 parents were directing movers while trying to keep track of 3 energetic children. Boxes covered the lawn. Furniture crowded the driveway. The situation looked chaotic. Anyone who has moved knows the feeling. Excitement and stress often arrive together. Carl approached them calmly. I could not hear the conversation from where I stood, but I saw smiles appear almost immediately. Then something happened that made me laugh. Carl started carrying boxes. Of course he did. Helping had always been easier for him than talking. Within minutes, several other neighbors joined in. The moving process accelerated. What could have been an exhausting day gradually transformed into a community effort. Watching the scene unfold felt strangely emotional. Not because people were helping. Communities often do that. The emotional part was seeing Carl at the center of it. If someone had shown me that image during my first week in town, I would never have believed it. Later that afternoon, after most of the unloading was complete, I walked over to say hello. The father introduced himself as Michael. His wife was Sarah. Their children immediately began exploring every corner of the neighborhood. The youngest appeared determined to ask 1,000 questions before sunset. The energy reminded me of my own children years earlier. As we talked, Michael mentioned that they had recently relocated for work. New town, new school, new beginning. The familiar themes instantly transported me back to my own first days in America. Change is exciting, but it also carries uncertainty. Social psychologists often explain that transitions create emotional vulnerability because people temporarily lose familiar routines, environments, and support systems. During those moments, even small acts of kindness can have a significant impact. Looking around at neighbors helping one another, I could see that principle in action. The next few weeks revealed something even more interesting. The new family quickly became part of the community. Their children made friends. They attended local events. They participated in neighborhood activities. Yet one relationship stood out above all others. Carl and the youngest child, Emma, developed an unexpected friendship. Emma possessed a remarkable talent for asking questions. Endless questions. Questions about birds, trees, gardening, weather, history. Anything that entered her mind immediately became a topic of investigation. Most adults eventually ran out of patience. Carl never did, in fact. He seemed to enjoy it. Every afternoon, Emma could be found somewhere near Carl's yard learning something new. Watching them together felt like observing two people healing each other without realizing it. Developmental researchers frequently note that meaningful intergenerational relationships benefit both children and older adults. Children gain knowledge and emotional support. Older adults gain purpose, connection, and engagement. The friendship between Carl and Emma seemed to demonstrate that principle perfectly. Then came the moment that truly revealed how far Carl had traveled emotionally. One evening, the neighborhood gathered for a small outdoor celebration. Nothing elaborate, just food, conversation, and community. As the event continued, Michael stood and thanked everyone for making his family feel welcome. He described how nervous they had been before moving. New town, new people, new environment, the usual worries. Then he said something simple. We got lucky. This neighborhood made us feel at home from day one. The statement earned warm smiles from everyone present. Yet my attention immediately shifted toward Carl. He looked down for a moment before quietly shaking his head and smiling to himself. I knew exactly what he was thinking. Years earlier, he had contributed to making someone feel unwelcome. Now he had helped create the opposite experience. Human beings often carry regret about past mistakes. The healthiest response is not self-punishment. It is growth. Carl embodied that truth. After the gathering ended, we walked home together. The evening air felt comfortable. Street lights reflected softly across the quiet neighborhood. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Carl broke the silence. Funny thing about life. I looked at him. What's that? He smiled. Sometimes the lesson shows up before you're ready to learn it. The statement perfectly captured our shared history. When I first arrived, Carl had been trapped inside grief he did not fully understand. I had been struggling with insecurity and loneliness. Neither of us was ready for friendship. Yet time, patience, and honest conversation gradually changed both of us. Researchers studying personal growth often emphasize that transformation rarely occurs through a single breakthrough. More often, it emerges through accumulated experiences that slowly reshape perspectives and behaviors. Looking back, our story followed exactly that pattern. No miracle moment solved everything. There were countless small moments instead. A storm morning, a cup of coffee, a shared memory, a difficult conversation, tiny experiences building towards something larger. Then Carl said something I never expected to hear. You know, I owe you an apology. I immediately knew what he meant. The words from years ago still existed between us. even if they no longer carried the same emotional weight. Carl stopped walking and looked directly at me. I should have never said what I said. His voice was sincere. No excuses, no qualifications, just accountability. You didn't deserve it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I smiled. We've come a long way since then. Carl laughed. That's one way to put it. We resumed walking. Yet, as we approached our homes, I realized something important. The apology mattered, not because I needed it. The healing had already happened. It mattered because it completed a chapter that began the day I arrived. The story that started with rejection had evolved into mutual respect. And the final chapter, the one neither of us could have imagined years earlier, was about to reveal itself in the most meaningful way possible. Because soon another family would arrive. Another opportunity would appear. And the man who once said go back home would speak for very different words. Words that would perfectly capture everything this journey had become. Welcome, neighbor. Have you ever noticed that some of the most important endings do not feel like endings at all? They feel like beginnings wearing different clothes. Looking back on everything that happened in this neighborhood, that is exactly how the final chapter unfolded. There was no dramatic ceremony, no life-changing announcement, no movie star conclusion with perfect music playing in the background. Instead, the moment arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, hidden inside an ordinary day. Yet it became one of the most meaningful moments of the entire journey. Years had passed since I first arrived in America carrying boxes into a house that felt unfamiliar. Years had passed since I stood in my driveway questioning whether I belonged. Years had passed since a lonely man across the street looked at me and said, "Go back home." During that time, lives changed, seasons came and went, children grew taller, friendships deepened, grief softened, love expanded, and somewhere along the way, an entire neighborhood evolved into something that felt like family. One bright spring morning, another moving truck entered the neighborhood. It was a familiar sight, new family, new beginning, new story waiting to unfold. The truck stopped near the corner house that had been empty for several months. Workers opened the back doors, boxes appeared, furniture followed. The usual moving day chaos quickly took over. I happened to be watering plants in the front yard when I noticed the activity. Immediately, memories returned. Not just memories of my own arrival, but memories of every chapter that followed. The uncertainty, the awkward conversations, the loneliness, the friendship, the healing. It all felt strangely close despite the years that had passed. Then I noticed movement across the street. Carl had seen the moving truck too. For a moment, I simply watched. There was something almost symbolic about what happened next. Without hesitation, Carl walked toward the new family. No pause, no reluctance, no emotional battle visible on his face. Just calm purpose. The father unloading boxes looked exhausted. The mother appeared overwhelmed. Two young children were already arguing about which bedroom belonged to whom. In other words, they looked exactly like countless families look on moving day. Carl approached them with the confidence of someone who had learned an important lesson and had no intention of forgetting it. I could not hear every word from my yard, but I heard enough. He smiled warmly and extended his hand, and he said four simple words, "Welcome, neighbor. Need help?" For a second, I actually stopped watering the plants. The sentence echoed through my mind because of how perfectly it contrasted with the words that had once defined our relationship. Welcome, neighbor. Not go back home. Not stay away. Not suspicion. Not resentment. Welcome. A single word carrying years of growth behind it. Researchers who study personal transformation often explain that meaningful change becomes visible through behavior rather than intention. People can talk about becoming different. They can promise improvement. But genuine growth eventually appears in actions. Watching Carl greet that family, I realized I was witnessing the visible evidence of years of emotional work. The new family accepted the offer immediately. Within minutes, Carl was carrying boxes, directing movers, and helping organize furniture. Soon several other neighbors joined in. The scene felt familiar because I had seen versions of it many times before. Yet this time felt different. This time, I understood the full story behind it. Later that afternoon, after most of the work was finished, the neighborhood gathered informally to welcome the newcomers. Children played in nearby yards. Adults exchanged introductions. Conversations flowed easily. As I looked around, I noticed something remarkable. Nobody seemed like an outsider. Not the family that had arrived that morning. Not the people who had moved there years earlier. Not me. Belonging had become the default setting of the community. Psychologists frequently emphasize that human beings possess a fundamental need for connection and acceptance. Communities thrive when people feel seen, valued, and included. Looking around the neighborhood, I could see that principle everywhere. The strongest part of a community is not the houses. It is the relationships between the people living inside them. That evening, after everyone returned home, Carl and I sat on our porches watching the sunset. The same street where our story began stretched quietly between us. Children rode bicycles. Neighbors waved while walking dogs. The atmosphere felt peaceful. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The silence was comfortable now. Friendship often creates that kind of silence. Finally, Carl smiled. "You heard what I said today." I laughed. "Pretty hard to miss," he nodded. "Funny, isn't it?" I knew exactly what he meant. Life had brought him full circle. Years earlier, pain had convinced him to push people away. Now experience had taught him the value of welcoming them. Grief had not disappeared. The memories of his wife and daughter remained part of him. They always would. But those memories no longer trapped him in the past. Instead, they helped him appreciate the people still present in his life. That realization contains an important lesson. Healing does not mean forgetting. It means learning how to carry the past without allowing it to control the future. Carl had learned that lesson. In many ways, so had I. When I first arrived in America, I thought success meant speaking perfect English. I thought belonging depended on eliminating mistakes. I thought confidence came from appearing strong. Life taught me something different. Confidence grows through action. Belonging grows through connection, and language becomes most powerful when it helps people understand one another. Throughout this journey, English was more than a skill. It was a bridge. Every conversation built another piece of that bridge. Every mistake taught a lesson. Every interaction created opportunity. Language learning stopped being about grammar and became about human connection. Looking back, I realized that is why stories are such powerful tools for learning English. Stories give words meaning. Emotions create memory. Curiosity keeps attention alive. The vocabulary may matter, but the human experience is what makes people remember. As darkness slowly settled over the neighborhood, Carl stood and prepared to go inside. Before opening his door, he turned toward me. "Glad you didn't listen to me." I smiled. "About what?" He laughed softly. "Back when I told you to go back home." For a moment, we both laughed. Then he added something I will never forget. "Turns out you were already where you belonged." The sentence stayed with me long after he disappeared inside. Maybe that is the real lesson of this story. Sometimes home is not the place where your journey begins. Sometimes it is the place where people choose to welcome you. Sometimes the stranger across the street becomes a friend. Sometimes pain becomes wisdom. Sometimes resentment becomes respect. And sometimes the simple words can tell the entire story. Welcome, neighbor. Before you leave, think about this for a moment. What if the person who hurts you today is carrying a story you cannot see? What if the door that seems closed is simply waiting for patience, understanding, and time? And what if the biggest change in your life doesn't begin with a perfect opportunity, but with one small conversation? In this story, a sentence filled with rejection became a friendship. A lonely neighbor became family. A place that felt unfamiliar became home. And a journey that started with go back home and ended with welcome, neighbor. Maybe that's why learning English through stories is so powerful, because you're not just learning new words. You're learning new perspectives. You're learning empathy. You're learning how people change, heal, forgive, and grow. And perhaps, without realizing it, you're also changing a little yourself. So here's a question for you. Who in your life deserves a second chance? The answer may surprise you. If you enjoy this slow English story, keep listening, keep reading, and keep speaking English every day. Small steps may feel invisible today, but one day you'll look back and realize they change everything. A new story is waiting in the next video, a new lesson, a new mystery, a new journey, and maybe a new part of yourself you haven't discovered yet. Subscribe now and join thousands of English learners improving their listening, reading, speaking, vocabulary, pronunciation, and fluency through inspiring real-life style stories. Like this video if you believe people can change. Leave a comment. Have you ever turned an enemy into a friend? Turn on notifications so you never miss our next slow English story, English listening practice, and learn English through stories video. Remember, sometimes the words that change your life are not the words you hear first. They're the words that come after you choose to stay. See you in the next story.